spooky place.
Have you ever felt the thrill of stepping into the unknown, only to realize too late that some doors should never be opened? Tonight, you'll walk alongside them, down a hallway that wasn't supposed to exist, where every door is a mistake waiting to be made. Sleep well if you can. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Whispering Walls. The young couple, Emma and Daniel, had always dreamed of a fresh start. When they received the news of inheriting a sprawling, abandoned mansion from a distant relative they barely remembered, it felt like fate. The estate, known as Blackthorn Manor, was nestled deep within a dense forest, its Gothic spires piercing the sky like jagged teeth. The locals in the nearby village spoke of it in hushed tones, warning the couple to stay away. But Emma and Daniel, fueled by curiosity and the allure of a new beginning, dismissed the superstitions as mere folklore. The first few days were idyllic. The grandeur of the mansion was breathtaking. Ornate chandeliers, towering bookshelves, and intricate tapestries that seemed to tell stories of their own. They spent their days exploring the endless rooms, each one more opulent than the last. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness cloaked the manor, an unsettling stillness settled over the house. It began with faint whispers. At first, Emma thought it was the wind rustling through the trees outside, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if the walls themselves were alive. Daniel dismissed it as their imagination, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One night, as they lay in bed, the whispers became coherent sentences. The voices were soft, almost melodic, but their words sent chills down their spines. "Welcome home," the walls murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Emma bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his face pale. "It's just the house settling," he said, though his voice trembled. But the whispers didn't stop. Night after night, they grew louder, more insistent. The walls began to reveal secrets, dark, horrifying secrets. They spoke of the previous occupants, a family who had lived in the manor centuries ago. The father, a cruel and power-hungry man, had dabbled in forbidden rituals, seeking immortality. The mother, driven to madness, had poisoned their children one by one, believing it would save them from his experiments. The walls recounted their final moments, the screams, the blood, the curses that bound their souls to the house forever. Emma and Daniel tried to leave, but the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and groaning as if alive. The once beautiful mansion now felt like a prison, its grandeur replaced by an oppressive, malevolent energy. One fateful night, the whispers reached a crescendo. "You'll never leave," the walls hissed. "You belong to us now." Panicked, Emma and Daniel ran to the front door, only to find it gone. The windows, too, had vanished, replaced by solid, unyielding stone. The mansion had sealed itself shut, trapping them inside. Desperation set in as they searched for a way out, but the house seemed to shift and change around them. Hallways led to dead ends. Rooms they had never seen before appeared out of nowhere, and the whispers followed them everywhere, growing louder and more menacing. Days turned into weeks, though time itself became meaningless within the manor's walls. Emma and Daniel began to change. Their reflections in the mirrors grew distorted, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The whispers infiltrated their minds, feeding them lies and driving them apart. Daniel accused Emma of conspiring with the house, while Emma blamed Daniel for bringing them there in the first place. One night, Emma awoke to find Daniel gone. She searched the house, calling his name, but the only response was the mocking laughter of the walls. Finally, she found him in the basement, standing before an ancient, blood-stained altar. His eyes were blank, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Join us," the walls urged. "Become one with the house." Emma screamed as Daniel raised a knife, his movements jerky and unnatural. She tried to run, but the walls closed in around her, their whispers deafening. The last thing she saw was Daniel's face, contorted with a mixture of sorrow and malice, as the knife descended. When the villagers finally mustered the courage to investigate the manor, they found it empty. The doors and windows were intact, but there was no sign of Emma or Daniel. The only clue was a single sentence etched into the wall of the grand foyer, written in a hand that was neither Emma's nor Daniel's. "The house always wins." Years later, another couple arrived at Blackthorn Manor, drawn by its beauty and the promise of a new beginning. As they stepped inside, the walls began to whisper, soft and inviting. The new couple, Claire and Mark, were unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within the walls of Blackthorn Manor. Like Emma and Daniel before them, they were enchanted by the mansion's grandeur. The high ceilings, the intricate woodwork, and the sprawling garden seemed like a dream come true. The real estate agent had been vague about the property's history, mentioning only that it had been vacant for some time. Claire and Mark, eager to start their lives together, didn't ask questions. The first night was peaceful. They lit a fire in the grand fireplace, unpacked their belongings, and toasted to their new home. But as the clock struck midnight, the house began to stir. At first, it was subtle, a faint creak of the floorboards, a soft rustling in the shadows. Claire dismissed it as the house settling, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The whispers started on the second night. Claire was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she heard it, a faint, almost melodic murmur. She turned off the faucet and listened, but the sound faded. She called out to Mark, but he was upstairs, oblivious. By the third night, the whispers were impossible to ignore. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the halls like a chorus of lost souls. Claire and Mark tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, the wind, their imaginations, but deep down, they knew it was something else. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. Claire clutched Mark's hand as the voices coalesced into a single, chilling sentence. "You shouldn't have come." Mark jumped to his feet, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Claire nodded, her heart pounding. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." But when they tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed shut, as if the house itself was holding them captive. Panic set in as they searched for another way out, but every door and window they tried was locked tight. The whispers grew louder, more menacing. The walls began to tell stories, horrific tales of the previous occupants. They spoke of Emma and Daniel, the young couple who had vanished without a trace. They recounted the rituals performed in the basement, the blood spilled on the altar, and the curses that bound the souls of the dead to the house. Claire and Mark tried to stay strong, but the house was relentless. It played on their fears, twisting their thoughts and driving them to the brink of madness. Claire began to see shadows moving in the corners of her vision, while Mark swore he heard footsteps following him wherever he went. One night, Claire awoke to find Mark gone. She searched the house, calling his name, but the only response was the mocking laughter of the walls. Finally, she found him in the attic, standing before an old, dusty mirror. His reflection was distorted, his eyes black and empty. "Join us," the walls whispered. "You belong to the house now." Claire screamed as Mark turned to her, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. He reached for her, his movements jerky and unnatural. She tried to run, but the walls closed in around her, their whispers deafening. The last thing she saw was Mark's face, contorted with a mixture of sorrow and malice, as the shadows swallowed her whole. When the authorities finally arrived, the house was empty. The doors and windows were intact, but there was no sign of Claire or Mark. The only clue was a single sentence etched into the wall of the grand foyer, written in a hand that was neither Claire's nor Mark's. "The house always wins." Years passed, and Blackthorn Manor remained abandoned, its dark secrets buried beneath layers of dust and decay. But the whispers never stopped. They echoed through the halls, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to arrive. And one day they did. A new couple, drawn by the mansion's beauty and the promise of a new beginning, stepped inside. As they marveled at the grandeur of the house, the walls began to whisper, soft and inviting. The new couple, Sarah and James, were thrill seekers. They had heard the rumors about Blackthorn Manor, the disappearances, the whispers, the curses. But instead of fear, they felt excitement. They were filmmakers, drawn to the idea of documenting the haunted mansion for their next project. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and a sense of invincibility, they stepped across the threshold, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The first day was spent setting up their equipment. They filmed every room, capturing the mansion's eerie beauty. The grandeur of the place was undeniable, but there was an undercurrent of unease that neither could ignore. The air felt heavy, and the silence was unnerving, as if the house itself was holding its breath. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. Sarah thought it was interference on their audio equipment, but when she played back the recordings, the whispers were clear, soft, melodic, and chilling. James dismissed it as a trick of the wind, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The next day, they explored the basement. It was a dark, damp space, filled with old furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room stood the altar, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Sarah felt a wave of nausea as she approached it, but James was fascinated. He set up a camera and began filming, narrating as if he were hosting a documentary. "This is where the previous occupants performed their rituals," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Some say the house feeds on the souls of those who enter. Others believe it's cursed, bound by the blood spilled here." As he spoke, the whispers grew louder. Sarah clutched James's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she asked. James nodded, but he didn't stop filming. "This is incredible," he said. "The audio is picking up everything. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispers were no longer faint. They were clear, coherent, and directed at them. "You shouldn't have come," the walls hissed. "You'll never leave." Sarah grabbed James's hand. "We need to go. Now." They ran upstairs, but the front door was gone. The windows, too, had vanished, replaced by solid stone. The house had sealed itself shut, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they searched for a way out, but the house seemed to shift and change around them. Hallways led to dead ends. Rooms they had never seen before appeared out of nowhere, and the whispers followed them everywhere, growing louder and more menacing. Days turned into weeks, though time itself became meaningless within the manor's walls. Sarah and James began to change. Their reflections in the mirrors grew distorted, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The whispers infiltrated their minds, feeding them lies and driving them apart. James accused Sarah of sabotaging their project, while Sarah blamed James for bringing them there in the first place. One night, Sarah awoke to find James gone. She searched the house, calling his name, but the only response was the mocking laughter of the walls. Finally, she found him in the attic, standing before an old, dusty mirror. His reflection was distorted, his eyes black and empty. "Join us," the walls whispered. "You belong to the house now." Sarah screamed as James turned to her, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. He reached for her, his movements jerky and unnatural. She tried to run, but the walls closed in around her, their whispers deafening. The last thing she saw was James's face, contorted with a mixture of sorrow and malice, as the shadows swallowed her whole. When the authorities finally arrived, the house was empty. The doors and windows were intact, but there was no sign of Sarah or James. The only clue was a single sentence etched into the wall of the grand foyer, written in a hand that was neither Sarah's nor James's. "The house always wins." Years later, another couple arrived at Blackthorn Manor, drawn by its beauty and the promise of a new beginning. As they stepped inside, the walls began to whisper, soft and inviting, "Welcome home." And so the cycle continued, the house feeding on the souls of those who entered, its whispers growing louder with each new victim. Blackthorn Manor stood as a monument to darkness, its secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to arrive. For the house always wins. The portrait that watches. The old mansion stood at the edge of the town, shrouded in mist and mystery. Its once grand facade was now crumbling, its windows dark and lifeless. The family that moved in, a mother, father, and their two teenage children, Emily and Jack, had hoped to restore it to its former glory. But the house had other plans. It was on a rainy afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, that they found the portrait. The painting was large, framed in ornate gold that had tarnished with age. The woman in the portrait was breathtakingly beautiful, with piercing green eyes that seemed to glow even in the dim light. Her lips were curled into a faint, enigmatic smile, and her hand rested delicately on the arm of a chair. But there was something unsettling about her gaze. It felt as though she were watching them. "Creepy," Jack muttered, brushing dust off the frame. "Why would anyone paint something like this?" Emily, ever the curious one, leaned closer. "She's kind of hypnotic, don't you think? Like she's alive?" Their mother, Sarah, shivered. "Let's just leave it here. We can deal with it later." But the portrait wasn't content to stay in the attic. That night, as the family slept, a faint creaking sound echoed through the house. Emily woke to the sensation of being watched. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw a shadow move across her wall. When she turned, the portrait was hanging above her dresser, the woman's eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Mom, Dad!" Emily screamed. The family rushed in, but by the time they arrived, the portrait was gone. They searched the house, but there was no sign of it. Sarah insisted it was just a nightmare, but Emily knew better. The woman in the painting had been there. She had moved. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. The portrait reappeared in different rooms, always in a new position. The woman's expression, once serene, began to change. Her smile faded, replaced by a scowl. Her eyes, once soft, now burned with anger. And then there was her hand. It no longer rested on the chair. It was outstretched, as if reaching for something or someone. One night, Jack woke to the sound of footsteps above his room. He grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs to the attic. The door was ajar, and a cold breeze seeped through the crack. Inside, the portrait hung in the center of the room, the woman's face twisted in fury. Her hand was no longer on the canvas. It was outside it, clawing at the air. Jack stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam of light flickered, and in the darkness, he heard a whisper. Soon, the family tried to leave the house, but the doors and windows wouldn't open. Their phones had no signal, and the car wouldn't start. They were trapped. That night, they gathered in the living room, huddled together as the house groaned and creaked around them. The portrait appeared on the wall, the woman's hand now fully extended, her fingers curling as if beckoning them closer. "We have to destroy it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way." They grabbed a knife and approached the painting, but as Sarah raised the blade, the woman's eyes flashed, and the knife flew from her hand. The family froze as the woman's lips moved, her voice echoing through the room. "You cannot stop me. I am almost free." The next morning, the portrait was gone again. But this time, so was Emily. They searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Then they heard it, a faint humming coming from the attic. They rushed upstairs and found the portrait hanging in the center of the room. Emily was standing in front of it, her back to them. "Emily?" Sarah called softly. Emily turned, and the family gasped. Her eyes were no longer her own. They were the woman's eyes, glowing and malevolent. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was the woman's. "I'm free now," Emily said, her voice a chilling blend of her own and the woman's. The portrait was empty. The woman was gone. The family tried to save Emily, but the woman's presence was too strong. She spoke in riddles, taunting them with secrets from their past. She knew things she couldn't possibly know, things they had never told anyone. And then she began to change. Her skin grew paler, her movements more fluid, until she was no longer Emily at all. She was the woman from the portrait, alive and walking among them. Desperate, the family turned to the town's historian, an elderly man who had lived there his entire life. He told them the story of Lady Eleanor, a woman who had lived in the mansion centuries ago. She had been accused of witchcraft and executed, but not before cursing the house and vowing to return. Her portrait, painted by a lover who had betrayed her, was said to be a vessel for her soul. "There's only one way to stop her," the historian said. "You must find the remains of her lover and burn them. Only then will her spirit be at rest." The family searched the mansion's crypt deep beneath the house. There, they found a coffin with the name Thomas Whitaker engraved on it. Inside was a skeleton, its hands clutching a locket with a miniature portrait of Lady Eleanor. They burned the remains in the fireplace, the flames crackling and hissing as the woman's screams echoed through the house. When the fire died down, Emily collapsed. The woman's spirit was gone, but the damage had been done. The family moved out of the mansion, leaving it to rot once more. But as they drove away, Emily glanced back and saw a figure standing in the attic window. It was the woman, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes burning with fury. The family thought they had escaped. They moved to a small house on the other side of town, far from the decaying mansion and its horrors. But peace was fleeting. Emily, though free from Lady Eleanor's possession, was not the same. She would wake in the middle of the night, her eyes wide and unseeing, whispering words in a language none of them understood. She would stare at walls for hours, as if watching something only she could see. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of Emily screaming. She rushed to her daughter's room and found her standing in front of the mirror, her reflection twisted and distorted. The reflection wasn't Emily's. It was Lady Eleanor's, her lips curled into a cruel smile. "She's still here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "She's inside me." The portrait was empty, but the curse was far from over. The family sought help from priests, psychics, and even a paranormal investigator, but nothing worked. The investigator, a grizzled man named Victor, told them the truth they didn't want to hear. "You didn't destroy her completely. Burning her lover's remains weakened her, but she's still tied to your daughter. She's using Emily as an anchor to this world." Victor explained that Lady Eleanor's spirit was fragmented, her essence scattered but not destroyed. To banish her for good, they would need to perform a ritual at the mansion, where her power was strongest. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. Reluctantly, the family agreed. They returned to the mansion, the air thick with dread as they stepped inside. The house seemed to groan in recognition, the walls closing in around them. The portrait was still missing, but they could feel her presence, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on them. Victor led them to the attic, where he set up a circle of salt and candles. He instructed Emily to sit in the center, while the rest of the family stood at the edges, holding hands. As he began the ritual, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered, their flames turning an eerie blue. Emily's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back as Lady Eleanor's voice erupted from her throat. "You think you can banish me?" she snarled. "I am eternal." Victor continued chanting, his voice steady despite the chaos. The air crackled with energy, and the walls seemed to pulse like a living thing. Suddenly, the portrait appeared on the wall, the canvas rippling as if something were trying to break free. Lady Eleanor's hand emerged, clawing at the air, followed by her face, twisted in rage. "Now!" Victor shouted. "Break the connection." Sarah and Jack lunged forward, grabbing Emily's hands and pulling her out of the circle. Lady Eleanor's spirit howled, her form flickering as she was dragged back into the painting. The canvas tore, and a blinding light filled the room. When it faded, the portrait was gone, and the attic was silent. The family thought it was over. They returned home, exhausted but hopeful. For a while, life seemed normal. Emily's nightmares stopped, and the whispers ceased. But then one evening, Sarah noticed something strange. The locket they had found in Thomas Whitaker's coffin, the one with Lady Eleanor's miniature portrait, was sitting on the kitchen table. She had buried it with the remains. How had it gotten there? She picked it up, and the locket sprang open. Inside, the miniature portrait was no longer a static image. The woman's eyes moved, locking onto Sarah's. Her lips curled into a smile, and she whispered, "You cannot escape me." Sarah dropped the locket, but it was too late. The house began to shake, the walls cracking as shadows poured out of the corners. The portrait reappeared, larger and more menacing than before. Lady Eleanor stepped out of the canvas, her form solid and real. She was no longer bound by the painting. She was free, and her power was greater than ever. The family tried to fight, but they were no match for her. Lady Eleanor's laughter echoed through the house as she unleashed her wrath. Jack was the first to fall, his body crumpling to the floor as she drained the life from him. Sarah screamed, clutching Emily as they tried to flee, but the doors and windows were sealed. "You thought you could destroy me," Lady Eleanor hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "But I am more than a spirit. I am vengeance. I am death." Emily, trembling but defiant, stepped forward. "You won't take us," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't let you." Lady Eleanor laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You have no choice, child. Your blood is my blood now." In a final, desperate act, Emily grabbed the locket and smashed it against the wall. The miniature portrait shattered, and Lady Eleanor screamed, her form flickering. But it wasn't enough. She lunged at Emily, her hands closing around her throat. Sarah tried to pull her away, but she was thrown across the room. As Emily struggled, she felt something awaken inside her, a spark of power she hadn't known was there. She reached out, her hand glowing with a strange light, and touched Lady Eleanor's chest. The spirit froze, her eyes widening in shock. "No," Lady Eleanor whispered. "This is impossible." Emily's voice was steady now, filled with a strength she didn't know she had. "You're wrong. I'm not your anchor. I'm your end." The light spread, consuming Lady Eleanor's form. She let out a final, ear-splitting scream before disintegrating into ash. The house fell silent, the shadows retreating as the air grew warm once more. But the victory came at a cost. Emily collapsed, her body weak and trembling. Sarah crawled to her side, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved us." Emily smiled faintly, but her eyes were distant. "She's gone, but I can still feel her. A part of her is still inside me." Sarah's heart sank. The battle was over, but the war was not. Lady Eleanor's essence had left a mark on Emily, a darkness that would never fully fade. As they left the house, Emily glanced back one last time. In the attic window, she saw a faint shadow, a flicker of green eyes watching her. The curse was broken, but the nightmare was far from over. The family moved again, this time to a bustling city far from the town and the cursed mansion. They hoped the noise and chaos would drown out the lingering dread that clung to them. Emily, though physically recovering, was a shadow of her former self. Her once vibrant eyes were now hollow, and she often spoke in whispers, as if afraid someone, or something, might hear her. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was just trauma, that Emily would heal with time. But deep down, she knew better. The darkness that had taken root in her daughter was growing, feeding on her fear and pain. And then there were the dreams. Every light, Emily would wake screaming, her skin icy to the touch. She would describe the same nightmare: a dark forest, a crumbling mansion, and Lady Eleanor standing at the edge of the trees, her hand outstretched. "You belong to me," she would whisper. "You always have." One evening, Sarah found Emily in the kitchen, staring at the wall. Her fingers were tracing patterns in the air, as if she were painting something only she could see. When Sarah approached, Emily turned to her, her eyes glazed and distant. "She's teaching me," Emily said, her voice eerily calm. "She says I have her power now. I can see things, do things." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Emily, listen to me. That woman is gone. She can't hurt you anymore." Emily smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was Lady Eleanor's. "She's not gone, Mom. She's here." The next morning, Sarah woke to find the walls of the house covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like ash. Emily was sitting in the living room, her hands stained black, her expression blank. When Sarah tried to wipe the symbols away, they wouldn't budge. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Desperate, Sarah reached out to Victor, the paranormal investigator. He arrived the next day, his face grim as he examined the symbols. "These are ancient," he said. "They're meant to summon something or someone." "Lady Eleanor?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Victor shook his head. "No, something worse. These symbols are a gateway. Emily, or whatever is inside her, is trying to open it." That night, the house was plunged into chaos. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Emily locked herself in her room, her voice echoing with a chilling blend of her own and Lady Eleanor's. "You cannot stop what's coming," she said. "The veil is thinning. They are waiting." Victor tried to break down the door, but it wouldn't budge. The symbols pulsed brighter, and the walls began to crack, shadows pouring out like smoke. Sarah screamed as the shadows took shape, forming grotesque figures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. They were not just spirits. They were something older, darker. "Emily," Sarah cried. "Fight her, please." There was a moment of silence, and then the door burst open. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing green, her body surrounded by a swirling vortex of shadows. "It's too late," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers. "The gate is open." Victor grabbed Sarah and pulled her back as the shadows closed in. He began chanting, his voice rising above the chaos, but the shadows were too strong. They swarmed around Emily, lifting her off the ground as she laughed, a sound that was both hers and Lady Eleanor's. "You should have left me in the painting," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Now you will all suffer." The room erupted in light, and for a moment, everything went still. When the light faded, Emily was gone. The symbols on the walls were scorched, and the shadows had retreated. But the air was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Sarah collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Victor knelt beside her, his face pale. "We have to find her," he said. "Whatever she's opened, we have to close it." But Sarah knew it was too late. Emily was gone, consumed by the darkness that had taken root in her. And Lady Eleanor, she was more than a spirit now. She was a force, a harbinger of something far worse. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Emily. The house was quiet, but Sarah could still feel her presence, a cold, lingering shadow in the corners of her mind. She would wake in the middle of the night, certain she heard Emily's voice whispering her name. And then there were the dreams, the same dark forest, the same crumbling mansion, and Emily standing at the edge of the trees, her hand outstretched. "Come find me, Mom," she would say. "I'm waiting." Sarah knew she couldn't ignore it. She packed a bag and returned to the town, to the mansion where it had all begun. The house was worse than she remembered, its walls blackened and twisted, as if it had been burned from the inside out. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. She stepped inside, her heart pounding. The attic was waiting, the door ajar, a faint green light spilling out. She climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the top, she saw it, the portrait hanging in the center of the room. But it wasn't Lady Eleanor in the painting anymore. It was Emily. Her daughter's eyes were glowing, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. Her hand was pressed against the canvas, as if trying to break free. And then she spoke, her voice a faint, desperate whisper. "Tell me, Mom, she's still here. She's everywhere." Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the canvas. It was warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then the shadows closed in, and the light went out. When Sarah woke, she was lying on the attic floor. The portrait was gone, but the air was thick with the scent of roses and decay. She could feel it, the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching her from the shadows. Emily was gone, but the darkness remained, and it was hungry. The end, or is it? The endless hallway. It started as a joke, a dare, something to pass the time on a cold October night. The Blackwood mansion had stood abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in tragedy and whispers of the supernatural. Locals claimed the house had a mind of its own, that it changed, twisted, and devoured those who stayed too long. But to James, Kara, Dylan, and Becca, it was just another urban legend. They broke in just past midnight, their laughter echoing through the grand but decayed foyer. Moonlight streamed through shattered stained glass windows, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. The scent of rot clung to the walls. "Let's make this quick," Becca muttered, arms crossed. "Relax," Dylan grinned, switching on his flashlight. "It's just an old house." But then they found the hallway. It wasn't on the blueprints Kara had pulled up on her phone before they arrived. It hadn't been there when they first walked in. Long, narrow, lined with doors on either side, each identical, deep mahogany with tarnished brass handles. The air was stale, charged with something they couldn't name. "This wasn't here before," James whispered. "Maybe we just missed it?" Kara suggested weakly. Becca shook her head. "No way." Curiosity got the better of them. Dylan, the boldest of the group, reached for the nearest door and yanked it open. Inside was a perfect replica of his childhood bedroom. The same posters, the same worn-out blue carpet, the same baseball bat leaning against the desk. A chill ran down his spine. "What the hell? How is this even possible?" James murmured. Dylan stepped inside, his breath hitching. This is my room. I swear it's my..." The door slammed shut behind him. The others lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. They pounded on the wood, calling Dylan's name, but there was only silence. And then the door disappeared. The hallway remained unchanged, yet where Dylan's door had been was now nothing but smooth, unbroken wall. Becca let out a strangled scream. "No, no, no, no. What the hell just happened? We have to get out of here," James said, his voice barely steady. But Kara had already turned to another door. Dylan could still be in there. Maybe there's another way. She shoved it open before anyone could stop her. The room inside was a field. Sunflowers, tall and golden, stretched as far as the eye could see under a burning red sky. The scent of something sweet and rotten drifted from the stalks. A single scarecrow stood in the distance, its head lolling unnaturally. Kara hesitated. Then, as if pulled by something unseen, she stepped inside. The moment her foot touched the soil, the scarecrow moved. Its head snapped up, empty socket staring. The sunflowers rustled, though there was no wind. The door slammed shut and vanished. James staggered backward, gripping his head. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." Becca turned to run, but the hallway had stretched impossibly long, the way back swallowed by darkness. Only the remaining doors remained, waiting. James clenched his fists. "We stick together. We..." But Becca was already reaching for another door. She didn't care where it led. Anywhere was better than this. She pulled it open, and the world on the other side was black. Not darkness, but absence. A void that devoured light, sound, even thought. Becca gasped as an unseen force wrapped around her and yanked her inside. James screamed her name. Gone. Only he remained. The hallway was silent. The doors stood like sentinels, waiting, shaking. James turned back toward the way they'd come. Except now, there was nothing behind him. The hallway stretched forward endlessly. No entrance, no exit. A whisper slithered through the air. "You shouldn't have come." The walls trembled. They inched closer. James broke into a run. But with every step, the walls narrowed, pressing in, suffocating. The last door at the end of the hallway stood ajar, something writhing in the darkness beyond. He had no choice. Gasping for breath, he lunged through, and the door slammed shut behind him. Silence fell over the hallway. The walls receded. The doors stood tall, waiting. Then, from the shadows, a new entrance appeared. Somewhere, outside the mansion, another group of friends was daring each other to go inside. The door behind James was gone. He stood in absolute darkness. Not the kind where your eyes just needed to adjust. This was something deeper, more unnatural. The air was thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. It reeked of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. A whisper slithered through the void. Do you remember how it ends? James turned sharply, but there was nothing. Just the dark. His breathing was ragged. His friends were gone. No exits. No sense of direction. He wasn't even sure he was standing on solid ground anymore. It felt like floating, yet every step was heavy, like wading through something thick and unseen. Then a sound, soft at first, a tick-tick-tick like fingernails tapping on glass. Then came the laughter. It was wrong. Echoing, layered, the voices overlapping like a broken record. High-pitched giggles, deep guttural chuckles, voices that sounded like they were swallowing themselves mid-laugh. James clapped his hands over his ears. "Shut up," he whispered. "Shut up, shut up." The voices listened. The laughter stopped, and in its place, the breathing began. Low, ragged, wet. Right behind him, James froze that a cold breath touched his neck. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. A whisper crawled into his ear, so close it sent ice through his veins. "You were always the last one." Something grabbed his wrist. James screamed, his fingers long, too many of them, joints bending the wrong way, latched onto his arm. He thrashed, trying to break free, but the grip was like iron. The darkness peeled away, and suddenly, he was in the hallway again. Except it was different. The walls weren't wood anymore. They pulsed. The doors were gone, replaced by jagged, gaping holes, like mouths waiting to swallow him whole. The floor wasn't solid. It breathed, rising and falling beneath him like a living thing. And at the far end of the hallway, something waited. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its form flickered like a bad signal, shifting between different shapes, different faces. Dylan's, Kara's, Becca's. Their mouths stretched too wide in silent screams. James staggered back. No, this isn't real. The thing took a step forward. The hallway shrank. James turned to run, but the walls screeched, folding inward like massive ribs closing around a beating heart. The thing was closer now, its arms stretching, reaching. "You don't get to leave." The voices of his friends came from its mouth. James slammed his eyes shut. "No, this isn't real. This isn't real." The thing laughed, and the walls collapsed outside. The Blackwood mansion stood silent beneath the moonlight. The front door creaked open on its own, the night wind curling inside. And then, slowly, the house shifted. The hallway that shouldn't exist moved, rearranging itself, waiting for the next visitors, waiting for the next air. The doors were hungry, and soon, someone else would enter. The Blackwood mansion waited. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the ones it had taken. James, Dylan, Kara, Becca, gone swallowed by the hallway that should not exist. Their names would fade from memory. Their stories would be reduced to nothing more than whispers. Another tale to scare reckless thrill seekers. But inside, they were still screaming. James woke up gasping. Or was he still asleep? He was lying on something cold, wet, and breathing. The ground beneath him was not wood, not stone. It shifted as though something massive slithered just beneath the surface, restless. A dim, pulsing red light illuminated the space. Not from a lamp, not from fire, from the walls. They were made of flesh. James scrambled to his feet, his breath hitching in his throat. The walls twitched, veins snaking through them like roots, moving, pulsing with something thick and dark. The hallway was still here, but it had changed. It was alive. The doors were gone. In their place, grotesque, gaping mouths lined the corridor, stretched open in silent, agonized screams. Teeth jutted out from some, jagged and wet. Others were nothing but deep, bottomless pits. And then came the sound, not a whisper, not a laugh, a single, ragged, wet inhale. James turned, his stomach twisting. At the end of the hallway, something waited. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, fingers dragging across the pulsating floor. Its face, if it even had one, was ever changing, shifting between Dylan, Kara, Becca, and others James didn't recognize. Their expressions were hollow, mouths moving soundlessly, and then James saw himself, his own face stretched too wide, grinning. The thing twitched forward. James stumbled back, but the hallway shifted. The floor moved, rolling like a wave beneath his feet. The mouse on the wall sighed, exhaling air that reeked of rot. James, the voice was Becca's. You left us? James shook his head wildly. No, I tried to save you. The thing was closer now, its arms stretching toward him. The floor cracked. James fell, but he landed hard. Silence. James sat up, panting, hands shaking. The air was thick, humid, and the smell of something rancid filled his nostrils. He was in another hallway, but this one was different. The walls weren't flesh anymore. They were mirrors. Tall, endless mirrors, reflecting him over and over again. But something was wrong. His reflections weren't moving with him. They stood still, watching. Then, one by one, they started to turn. Not all at once. Not the way reflections should. Some moved faster, their heads snapping toward him at unnatural angles. Others were slower, their smiles curling wider than any human mouth should allow. James backed away. The reflections stepped forward. One of them pressed its hand against the glass. Then another, and another. The sound of glass cracking filled the hallway. James spun around, searching for an exit. There was none. The mirrors shattered, and the reflections stepped out. They weren't him. Not anymore. Their skin was stretched too tight, their eyes black, empty voids. Their mouths split open, revealing too many teeth. James turned to run, but the hands grabbed him, pulled him, dragged him through the glass. The Blackwood mansion stood silent, waiting. The hallway had fed, but it was always hungry. It would shift again, and soon, someone else would come. James was falling, not through air, not through space, through something thicker. It wrapped around him, clinging like wet fabric, suffocating, pressing into his skin, into his bones. The world outside the glass was gone. No light, no sound, only a deep, endless churning. Then a voice. Open your eyes, James. He didn't want to, but his body didn't listen. His eyes snapped open, and the darkness around him stared back. It wasn't just empty. It was full of things. Faces swam through the void, distorted and stretched, mouths open in silent screams. Hands reached for him, fingertips brushing his skin before dissolving like smoke. And then he saw them. Dylan, Kara, Becca, suspended in the darkness, their eyes black holes, their faces stretched into masks of endless agony. James tried to scream, but something thick and wet crawled down his throat. The void shifted, and he was somewhere else. James hit the ground hard, cold, wet, stone. The air was thick with the scent of mold and rot. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped, echoing in the vast space. He was in a chamber. The walls were carved from black stone, slick with something that moved, pulsed. The floor was uneven, littered with bones. Some human, some not. James forced himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't alone. Figures stood at the edges of the room, pressed against the stone like shadows, watching. Their bodies were twisted, limbs too long, spines arched at unnatural angles. Their faces were blank, just smooth, featureless flesh. Then one of them stepped forward. Its neck snapped. A mouth tore open where there had been none. "You don't belong here." James backed away. The wall sighed. A door appeared behind him, tall and crooked, its surface covered in scratches. Something had tried to claw its way out. He had no choice. He ran for it. The thing lurched after him, bones cracking with every movement. The other figures shifted, their eyeless faces following his every move. James reached the door, and something grabbed his ankle. Fingers cold, sharp, too many of them. He hit the ground, dragged backward, nails scraping against the stone. He kicked, thrashed, screamed. The figures closed in. Their whispers crawled into his skull. "You were the last one. You should have left. But now, you're ours." James let out a final, desperate scream, and the door swung open. Darkness swallowed him whole. The Blackwood mansion remained still, waiting. The hallway had shifted again, and outside, beneath the cold glow of the streetlights, a new group of friends stood at the gates, daring each other to enter. The house listened. The doors trembled, and deep within the walls, James was still screaming. The Blackwood mansion had always been hungry. It did not simply haunt. It did not merely trap. It consumed. James was gone. Not dead. Not alive. Just swallowed. Like Dylan. Like Kara. Like Becca. Like all the others before them, outside. The night was still. A new group of thrill-seekers gathered at the rusted iron gates, their laughter breaking the silence. "Come on, it's just an old house," one of them said. "Bet you won't make it past the front door," another teased. The mansion watched. The hallway shifted, rearranging itself, doors appearing and disappearing, waiting to be opened. And deep inside the house, a new voice whispered, a voice that had once belonged to James. "You shouldn't have come." The front door creaked open. The house was ready to feed again. The family that never left. The historian, Dr. Eleanor Graves, had always been drawn to the macabre. When she received the opportunity to document the history of Blackthorn Manor, a centuries-old estate nestled deep in the misty hills of rural England, she couldn't resist. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling facade and overgrown gardens a testament to its dark past. Locals whispered of curses, of a family wiped out in a single night, their blood staining the very walls of the house. But Eleanor was a skeptic. Ghosts and curses were for the superstitious, she thought. She was here for the facts. The first night in the manor was uneventful. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and the creaking of the old wooden floors echoed through the empty halls. Eleanor set up her workspace in the library, a cavernous room lined with dusty tomes and faded portraits of the Blackthorn family. It was there she found the journals. The first journal belonged to Lady Margaret Blackthorn, the matriarch of the family. Her elegant handwriting detailed the family's rise to prominence, their lavish parties, and their eventual downfall. But as Eleanor read further, the entries grew darker. Lady Margaret wrote of strange occurrences, shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the night, and the laughter of children when no children were present. The final entry was chilling. They are here. They have come for us. God help us all. The next journal belonged to Thomas Blackthorne, the eldest son. His entries were frantic, filled with paranoia and fear. He spoke of seeing his deceased younger siblings wandering the halls, their eyes hollow and their faces twisted in agony. He wrote of a presence that watched him from the corners of the room, a presence that grew stronger with each passing day. The final entry was a single sentence. The dining table is set. They are waiting for me. Eleanor's skepticism began to waver. The journals were too detailed, too visceral to be mere fiction. As she delved deeper into the family's history, she began to notice strange things. The temperature in the library would drop suddenly, her breath visible in the air. She would hear the faint sound of children laughing, though the rooms were empty. And then there were the shadows, dark, shapeless figures that seemed to flit just out of sight. One night, as she sat reading by candlelight, she heard a noise from the dining room. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like the scraping of a chair against the floor. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the dining room, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. The dining table was set for a feast, the silverware gleaming and the plates piled high with rotting food. Around the table sat the Blackthorne family, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on her. Lady Margaret, her once elegant gown now tattered and stained, smiled faintly. "You're part of the family now," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. Eleanor stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The figures began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. She turned and ran, the sound of their laughter echoing in her ears. She locked herself in the library, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key. But as she turned around, she realized she wasn't alone. The shadows had followed her. They swirled around the room, coalescing into the forms of the Blackthorne children. Their faces were twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes black voids. "Stay with us," they whispered in unison, their voices high-pitched and grating. "You're part of the family now." Eleanor woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat. She told herself it had been a nightmare, a product of her overactive imagination. But as she made her way to the dining room, she found the table set once again, the chairs pulled out as if waiting for guests. And there, at the head of the table, was a journal, a new one, with her name etched into the cover. She opened it to the first page, her hands shaking. The words were written in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing them. "The mansion has claimed me," it read. "I am one of them now." As the days passed, Eleanor's grip on reality began to slip. She would wake up in different rooms of the house, with no memory of how she got there. The journals multiplied, each one filled with her increasingly frantic scribbles. She wrote of the family's history, of their gruesome deaths, and of her own descent into madness. And always, the shadows watched. One night, she found herself standing in the dining room, the table set once again. The Blackthorne family sat around it, their faces pale and lifeless. Lady Margaret gestured to the empty seat at the head of the table. "Join us," she said. "You're part of the family now." Eleanor sat down, her movements stiff and mechanical. As she picked up the fork, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished silver. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She smiled faintly, the same grotesque smile she had seen on the faces of the Blackthorne children. The mansion had claimed another soul, and as the candles flickered and the shadows danced, the laughter of children echoed through the halls once more that Eleanor's transformation was slow, but inevitable. Days blurred into nights, and the line between reality and nightmare dissolved. She no longer remembered why she had come to Blackthorn Manor, nor did she care. The journals consumed her, their pages filling with her increasingly erratic handwriting. She wrote of the family's torment, their restless spirits, and the dark force that bound them to the mansion. But she also wrote of herself, her fears, her regrets, and the chilling realization that she was no longer alone in her own mind. The shadows were no longer content to simply watch. They began to speak to her, their voices a cacophony of whispers that echoed in her skull. They told her secrets about the Blackthorn family, about the mansion, and about herself. They spoke of the night the family died, of the blood that had been spilled, and of the curse that had been laid upon the house. And they spoke of the others who had come before her, the historians, the curious, the lost souls who had been drawn to the mansion, only to become part of its dark legacy. One night, as she sat in the library, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They guided her to a hidden compartment in the wall, behind a portrait of Thomas Blackthorn. Inside, she found a small, ornate box, its surface etched with strange symbols. The whispers urged her to open it, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Against her better judgment, she did. Inside the box was a locket, its surface tarnished with age. When she opened it, she found a lock of hair and a tiny photograph of a young girl. The girl's face was familiar. It was the same face she had seen in the shadows, the same face that haunted her dreams. The whispers told her the girl's name, Emily Blackthorn, the youngest daughter, who had died long before the rest of the family. As she held the locket, the room grew cold, and the shadows began to move. They swirled around her, forming the shape of a young girl. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide and pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They won't let me go." Eleanor's heart ached for the girl, but before she could respond, the shadows shifted again, and Emily was gone. In her place stood the rest of the Blackthorn family, their faces twisted in rage. "You shouldn't have done that," Lady Margaret hissed. "You've awakened her." The room erupted into chaos. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Eleanor like a suffocating blanket. She felt herself being pulled into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the void. When she awoke, she was in the dining room, seated at the head of the table. The family sat around her, their faces pale and lifeless. But this time, there was a new addition to the table, a small, empty chair, waiting for Emily. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than ever. They told her that the only way to free Emily and herself was to break the curse. But to do so, she would have to uncover the truth about the family's deaths, a truth that had been buried for centuries. Eleanor began to search the mansion, guided by the whispers and the occasional glimpse of Emily's ghostly form. She found hidden passages, secret rooms, and more journals, each one revealing a piece of the puzzle. She learned that the Blackthorn family had not been the victims of a random act of violence, but of a ritual gone wrong. Lady Margaret, desperate to protect her family from a rival's curse, had attempted a dark ritual to bind their souls to the mansion, ensuring their eternal protection. But something had gone horribly wrong, and instead of protecting them, the ritual had trapped their souls, condemning them to an eternity of torment. The final piece of the puzzle was found in the basement, in a room that had been sealed shut. The door was covered in the same symbols that had been etched into the box, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Inside, Eleanor found the remains of the ritual, a circle of salt, candles long since burned out, and a dagger stained with dry blood. But what chilled her to the core was the small, child-sized skeleton lying in the center of the circle. It was Emily, The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows closed in. Eleanor realized the truth. Emily had been the sacrifice, the key to the ritual. Her death had bound the family to the mansion, but her restless spirit had been trapped, unable to move on. To break the curse, Eleanor would have to perform the ritual again, this time correctly, and free Emily's soul. But the family would not let her go so easily. As she prepared the ritual, the shadows attacked, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. The dining table appeared once more, the family seated around it, their faces contorted in rage. "You cannot leave," Thomas snarled. "You are one of us now." Eleanor fought back, her determination fueled by the thought of freeing Emily. She lit the candles, drew the circle, and placed the locket in the center. As she began to chant the words from the journal, the shadows surged forward, but they were held back by an unseen force. Emily's ghostly form appeared, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the shadows were consumed by it. When the light faded, the mansion was silent. The dining table was gone, the family's spirits finally at rest. But as Eleanor looked down at the locket, she felt a chill run down her spine. The photograph of Emily was gone, replaced by a new one, a photograph of Eleanor herself. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "You're part of the family now." And as the candles flickered and died, the mansion's embrace, tightened once more to Eleanor's victory, was short-lived. Though the Blackthorn family's spirits had been laid to rest, the mansion was far from empty. The shadows, now devoid of the family's presence, seemed to grow stronger, more malevolent. The whispers that had guided her before now turned sinister, taunting her with promises of eternal torment. The locket, now bearing her photograph, felt heavy around her neck, a constant reminder that she had not truly escaped. The mansion itself seemed to shift and change around her. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Doors led to rooms that hadn't been there before, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Eleanor's sense of time dissolved. Days and nights blurred together, and she could no longer tell if she was awake or dreaming. The journals continued to fill with her writing, though she had no memory of picking up the pen. The entries grew darker, more desperate, as if the mansion was using her hand to document its own history. One night, as she wandered the halls, she heard the laughter again. It was faint, almost playful, but it sent a chill down her spine. She followed the sound to the nursery, a room she had never entered before. The door creaked open to reveal a scene that made her blood run cold. The room was pristine, untouched by time, with a rocking chair moving slowly back and forth. In the corner, a group of shadowy figures huddled together, their forms indistinct but unmistakably childlike. They turned to her, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices high-pitched and grating. "You're part of the family now." Eleanor tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind her. The shadows closed in, their forms solidifying into the shapes of children. They reached out to her, their tiny hands cold and clammy. She felt a sharp pain in her chest and looked down to see the locket glowing faintly, its surface hot to the touch. The photograph inside had changed again. Now it showed her surrounded by the shadowy children, her face pale and lifeless. She woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat, the locket still around her neck. The nursery door was closed, but the laughter lingered in her mind. She knew the mansion wasn't done with her. It had claimed her, just as it had claimed the Blackthorns, and it would not let her go. Determined to fight back, Eleanor began to search for a way to destroy the locket. She scoured the library for any mention of cursed objects, but the books seemed to rearrange themselves whenever she turned her back. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging her to give in, to accept her fate. But she refused. She would not become another ghost in the mansion's collection. Her search led her to the attic, a place she had avoided until now. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked ominously under her weight. In the center of the room was an old, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. As she approached, the whispers grew to a deafening roar, and the shadows surged forward, trying to stop her. But she was determined. She grabbed the mirror and smashed it against the floor, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. It was a grimoire, a book of dark magic, and it contained the key to breaking the curse. But as she flipped through the pages, she realized the cost. To destroy the locket, she would have to sacrifice a part of herself, a piece of her soul. The whispers grew frantic, the shadows twisting and writhing around her. "You cannot escape," they hissed. "The mansion will always claim its own." Eleanor hesitated, but only for a moment. She knew what she had to do. She followed the instructions in the grimoire, drawing a circle of salt around herself and placing the locket in the center. As she began to chant the incantation, the shadows attacked, their forms solidifying into grotesque shapes. The nursery children appeared again, their faces twisted in rage. "You belong to us," they screamed. But Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The locket began to glow, its surface cracking as the curse was broken. The pain in her chest grew unbearable, and she felt a part of herself being torn away. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The mansion itself seemed to shudder, the walls cracking and the air growing cold. When it was over, Eleanor was alone. The locket lay in pieces on the floor, its surface blackened and cracked. The whispers were gone, the shadows silent. But as she looked down at her hands, she saw that they were pale, almost translucent. The sacrifice had been made. A piece of her soul was gone, and with it, her connection to the living world. The mansion had claimed her, just as it had claimed the Blackthorns. But she was not a ghost, not yet. She was something in between, trapped in the liminal space between life and death. The mansion's halls were silent now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the shadows returned, before the whispers began again. As she wandered the empty halls, she felt the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on her. She was part of it now, bound to its dark legacy, and though she had broken the curse, she knew she would never truly be free. The locket was gone, but the mansion's embrace was eternal. And as the candles flickered and died, Eleanor Graves became just another chapter in its long, dark history. The mirror's reflection. The mansion stood at the edge of the town, shrouded in mist and whispers. Its grandeur was undeniable. Towering spires, ivy-clad walls, and stained glass windows that caught the faint light of the overcast sky. But its beauty was marred by the stories that clung to it like cobwebs. Stories of disappearances, madness, and a curse that no one dared to name. Yet, when Thomas Hargrove saw the listing, he couldn't resist. The price was unbelievably low, and the real estate agent, a nervous man with a twitch in his eye, assured him it was a steal. "A bit of history," the agent had said, "but nothing a man like you can't handle." Thomas moved in on a cold, gray afternoon. The house creaked and groaned as if protesting his presence, but he dismissed it as the settling of an old structure. He spent the first day exploring the sprawling rooms, each one more opulent than the last. The master bedroom, however, caught his attention. It was vast, with a high ceiling and a large, ornate mirror mounted on the wall opposite the bed. The mirror was framed in intricate carvings of twisting vines and faces that seemed to watch him as he moved. That first night, Thomas slept fitfully. The house was too quiet, the silence oppressive. He awoke in the early hours of the morning, his heart pounding. The room was bathed in moonlight, and as he sat up, his eyes fell on the mirror. It reflected the room perfectly. The bed, the wardrobe, the flickering candle on the nightstand. But something was off. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind him, just at the edge of the shadows. Thomas spun around, but the room was empty. He laughed nervously, chalking it up to his imagination. The next night, it happened again. This time, the figure was closer, its outline clearer. Thomas could make out the shape of a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. He searched the room, even the closet, but found nothing. The reflection, however, remained unchanged. The figure was there, unmoving, watching. Over the following weeks, the figure grew more detailed. Thomas could see the tattered clothes it wore, the skeletal hands that hung at its sides, and the faint, cruel smile that played on its lips. It inched closer each night, its presence growing more oppressive. Thomas stopped sleeping, spending his nights staring at the mirror, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did, not until the seventh night. That night, the figure was so close that Thomas could see the cracks in its pale skin and the darkness swirling in its eyes. He tried to look away, but his gaze was locked. The figure raised a hand, its fingers curling as if beckoning him. Thomas felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, though the room was still. He screamed, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, its reflection merging with his own, and then it stepped out of the mirror. Thomas vanished that night. The mansion stood silent once more, the master bedroom empty save for the mirror. Its surface gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting an empty room. Waiting for its next victim, months passed, and the mansion remained vacant. The townsfolk avoided it, crossing the street to steer clear of its shadow. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and eventually, a young couple, Elena and Mark, bought the property. They were skeptical of the stories, dismissing them as superstition. The mirror, they thought, was just a mirror. Elena was the first to notice it. She woke up one night, convinced she had seen someone standing in the corner of the room. The mirror reflected the room perfectly, except for the figure lurking behind her. Mark dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the nights wore on, the figure grew closer. Elena began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the mirror. She tried to cover it with a sheet, but the next morning, the sheet lay in tatters on the floor. Mark, growing increasingly concerned, suggested they leave, but Elena refused. She was determined to uncover the truth. One night, Elena stayed awake, staring at the mirror. The figure was closer than ever, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, though no one was there. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Join us." Elena screamed, and Mark rushed into the room. But it was too late. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its skeletal hand reaching for her. Mark watched in horror as Elena was pulled into the mirror, her reflection vanishing. The mirror now reflected two figures, the gaunt man and Elena, her face frozen in a silent scream. Mark fled the mansion, never to return. The mirror waited, its surface shimmering with malevolent anticipation. Years later, a historian named Dr. Evelyn Carter arrived in town, determined to uncover the mansion's secrets. She had heard the stories and believed they were rooted in fact. The mirror, she theorized, was a portal, a gateway to another realm. She moved into the mansion, setting up her equipment in the master bedroom. The first night, she saw the figures, Thomas, Elena, and the gaunt man. They watched her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and hunger. Evelyn was fascinated, not frightened. She spent her nights studying the mirror, recording every detail. But as the figures grew closer, she began to hear the whispers. "Join us." One night, Evelyn made a breakthrough. She discovered that the mirror was created by a 19th century occultist who had used it to trap souls. The gaunt man was the first victim, cursed to lure others into the mirror's depths. Evelyn realized too late that the mirror had been waiting for her. The figures stepped out, their cold hands closing around her. As she was pulled into the mirror, she saw the truth. The reflection was not of the room, but of the realm beyond, a realm of endless darkness and despair. The mirror now reflects three figures, their faces twisted in eternal agony. It waits, hungering for its next victim. And in the town below, the whispers grow louder, calling to those who dare to listen. The mansion, now infamous, stood as a monument to dread. No one dared approach it, not even the bravest souls. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children to stay away. But the mirror's hunger was insatiable, and it began to reach beyond the mansion's walls. One evening, a group of teenagers, daring each other to prove their courage, decided to spend the night in the mansion. They brought flashlights, laughter, and bravado, unaware of the darkness that awaited them. As they explored the house, their laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. In the master bedroom, one of the teens, a girl named Lily, noticed the mirror. Its surface gleamed in the dim light, drawing her in. She approached it, her reflection staring back at her. But something was wrong. Her reflection smiled, a smile she wasn't making. Behind her, the figures began to appear, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Lily screamed, and the others rushed to her side. But when they looked into the mirror, they saw only their own reflections. The group decided to leave, their courage shattered. But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The mirror began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light. The figures stepped out, one by one, their skeletal hands reaching for the teens. One by one, the teenagers were pulled into the mirror, their screams echoing through the mansion. By morning, the mansion was silent once more. The mirror reflected an empty room, but if one looked closely, they could see the faint outlines of new figures. Lily and her friends, their faces frozen in terror. The disappearances sparked panic in the town. People began to report strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and reflections that didn't match reality. The mirror's influence was spreading, its curse reaching beyond the mansion. A local priest, Father O'Connor, decided to confront the evil. Armed with holy water and a crucifix, he entered the mansion. The air was thick with malevolence, and the walls seemed to close in around him. In the master bedroom, he faced the mirror. The figures were there, watching him with hollow eyes. Father O'Connor began to pray, sprinkling holy water on the mirror. The figures recoiled, their faces twisting in rage. But as he continued, the mirror began to crack. The figures screamed, their voices a cacophony of despair. For a moment, it seemed the curse was broken, but then the mirror's surface rippled like water, and a cold hand shot out, grabbing Father O'Connor. He was pulled into the mirror, his crucifix falling to the floor. The cracks healed, and the mirror reflected an empty room once more. Years passed, and the mansion became a forgotten relic. But the mirror's hunger never waned. It called to those who were lost, desperate, or curious. One such person was a writer named Sarah, who had come to the town to research the legends. She was drawn to the mansion, unable to resist its dark allure. Sarah spent her days exploring the house, documenting its history. But at night, she felt the presence of the mirror. It called to her, its whispers growing louder. She tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. One night, she stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. The figures appeared, their hollow eyes filled with a mixture of pity and hunger. Sarah felt a cold hand on her shoulder, though no one was there. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Join us." She tried to turn away, but her reflection reached out, its hand breaking through the mirror's surface. Sarah screamed as she was pulled into the mirror, her reflection vanishing. The mirror now reflects another figure, its face twisted in eternal agony. It waits, hungering for its next victim. And in the town below, the whispers grow louder, calling to those who dare to listen. Join us. The mirror's curse is eternal, its hunger insatiable. It waits in the darkness, calling to those who are lost, desperate, or curious. Its whispers echo through the town, a constant reminder of the evil that lurks within the mansion. And as long as the mirror exists, the curse will continue, drawing in its victims one by one. The mansion stands as a monument to dread, its shadow stretching over the town. The mirror reflects an empty room, but if one looks closely, they can see the faint outlines of its victims, their faces frozen in eternal agony. The mirror waits, hungering for its next victim, and in the town below, the whispers grow louder, calling to those who dare to listen. The town, once vibrant and alive, had become a ghost of its former self. The whispers from the mansion had seeped into every corner, infesting the minds of the townsfolk. People began to see things, shadows moving where there should be none, reflections that didn't match their movements, and faces in windows that vanished when they looked again. The mirror's curse was no longer confined to the mansion. It was spreading, feeding on the fear and despair of the town. One by one, the townsfolk began to disappear. A child playing near the woods vanished, leaving only a faint trail of whispers. A shopkeeper closed his store one evening and was never seen again. Even the town's mayor, a man of logic and reason, was found staring into his bathroom mirror, muttering, "Join us," before he too disappeared. The mirror's influence grew stronger, its malevolence seeping into the very fabric of the town. Those who remained lived in constant fear, afraid to look into any reflective surface. But the mirror was cunning. It didn't need its victims to come to it anymore. It could reach out, pulling them into its dark realm through any reflection. That a private investigator named Victor Kane arrived in town, hired by the families of the missing to uncover the truth. Victor was a skeptic, a man who prided himself on his rationality. He had heard the stories of the mansion and the mirror, but he dismissed them as superstition. He was determined to find a logical explanation for the disappearances. Victor began his investigation at the mansion. As he stepped inside, he felt an oppressive weight settle over him. The air was thick, and the silence was deafening. He made his way to the master bedroom, where the mirror hung. Its surface gleamed, reflecting the room perfectly. Victor approached it, his reflection staring back at him. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, he noticed something in the reflection, a figure standing behind him. Victor spun around, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now. It was the gaunt man, his hollow eyes fixed on Victor. Behind him, other figures began to appear. Thomas, Elena, Father O'Connor, Sarah, and countless others. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes pleading. Victor tried to look away, but his gaze was locked. The whispers began, faint at first, then growing louder. "Join us." He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, though no one was there. The figures in the mirror reached out, their skeletal hands breaking through the surface. Victor screamed as he was pulled into the mirror, his reflection vanishing. The mirror now reflected another figure, its face frozen in eternal torment. It waited, hungering for its next victim, but as the mirror's power grew, it began to reveal its true nature. It was not merely a portal to another realm. It was a living entity, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of its victims. The figures trapped within it were not just reflections. They were fragments of its consciousness, extensions of its will. The mirror's influence spread beyond the town, reaching into neighboring villages and cities. People began to report strange occurrences, reflections that moved on their own, whispers in the night, and figures that appeared in mirrors and windows. The mirror was no longer confined to the mansion. It was everywhere, its hunger insatiable that a group of survivors, desperate to stop the mirror's curse, banded together. They were led by an elderly woman named Margaret, who claimed to have knowledge of the mirror's origins. According to her, the mirror was created by an ancient cult that sought to harness the power of the void, a realm of endless darkness and despair. The cult had been destroyed, but the mirror remained, a relic of their dark rituals. Margaret and the survivors devised a plan to destroy the mirror. They gathered ancient artifacts, holy relics, blessed weapons, and symbols of protection. They returned to the mansion, their hearts filled with fear and determination. As they entered the master bedroom, the mirror's surface rippled, and the figures within began to stir. Margaret stepped forward, holding a silver dagger engraved with runes. She began to chant, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her. The mirror's surface cracked, and the figures screamed in rage. The survivors joined in, their voices rising in unison. The mirror began to shatter, its surface breaking into countless shards. But as the mirror fell, a final figure emerged. The gaunt man, his hollow eyes filled with fury. He lunged at Margaret, his skeletal hands closing around her throat. She plunged the dagger into his chest, and he let out a deafening scream before dissolving in a shadow. The mirror was destroyed, its curse seemingly broken. The survivors breathed a sigh of relief, believing they had triumphed. But as they left the mansion, they noticed something strange. The shards of the mirror were gone, and in their place were faint reflections, twisted, distorted versions of themselves. The mirror was gone, but its curse lived on. The survivors began to experience strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and reflections that didn't match reality. One by one, they disappeared, their faces appearing in mirrors and windows, frozen in eternal agony. The mirror's curse was eternal, its hunger insatiable. It had been destroyed, but its essence remained, spreading its malevolence through every reflective surface. The town was abandoned, a ghostly reminder of the evil that had consumed it. But the whispers continued, echoing through the empty streets, calling to those who dared to listen. Join us, and in the darkness, the mirror waited, hungering for its next victim. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.